I also think that when those of us who use this sort of not very lovely phrase, the liberal world order, I wish I had a better phrase. I have toyed with other phrases to describe what was created, but I haven't really come up with a better one. But I think that Americans have a number of misconceptions about this international system that the United States created after World War II, which in a way help undermine their support for it. The first one I've already indicated, which is the belief that this order was created in response to the Soviet Union and the onset of the Cold War. I find even highly educated people like Graham Allison at Harvard saying that the liberal world order was created in response to the Cold War. But as it happens, that is historically inaccurate. That really the basic outlines and even some of the key elements of this liberal world order were created before anyone thought there was going to be a problem with the Soviet Union. The basic vision and some of the basic elements of this order were established during World War II. Certainly Bretton Woods Conference is 1944. The decision to start having bases around the world from which the United States could operate in both Europe and Asia, those bases, those strings of bases were being planned as early as 1943 by American strategic planners. And the basic idea that the United States after World War II was going to have to play an entirely different role in the world than it had played prior to World War II was firmly fixed at a time when Uncle Joe Stalin was still our ally, when people like Franklin Roosevelt and Dean Acheson and others thought that the post-war world would be one of cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Cold War actually came as a kind of surprise, and people sort of woke up in early 1946 or roughly thereabout. So that's one misconception, and it's related to another misconception, I think, which is that I think a lot of people, when they hear the phrase liberal world order or they hear people talk about this, think that this order is based on some very idealistic notion of remaking the world in America's image. You hear that all the time, that it's a kind of Wilsonian project, a kind of utopian idea of making a brand new world based on a very optimistic assessment of what can be accomplished in the world. As a matter of fact, the founders of this liberal world order it was really based on a deep pessimism about both the international system and about human nature, and a pessimism that was hard earned for that generation that lived through World War I, the 20s, and then the 30s, and then World War II. And that really is the generation of Franklin Roosevelt and Dean Acheson and Harry Truman and others, many people, most of whom were born in the latter part of the 19th century and went through that entire sort of history of disaster in which the worst acts of inhumanity that anyone could ever imagine took place. And so they had a very, I would say, dark view of humanity. I think they worked on the assumption that the natural tendency of the international system was toward chaos and conflict, because that is what they had witnessed. And I think that they had no illusions about human nature necessarily being a benevolent force in the world. I think they were hopeful that human beings, sort of better angels, could be appealed to, but they built a system that was really designed to contain those other angels, the not better angels, the sort of darker forces. And in this respect, I think they were very much like the founders of the American Republic, who also did not base the American system on a sort of optimistic reading of human nature, but really on the assumption that human beings could be counted on to behave selfishly and to pursue their ambitions regardless of others. And so they created this famous system of checks and balances and other institutional structures in the hope of channeling these other forces of human nature in a positive direction. I think that's essentially what the founders of the liberal world order set up. And I think that they probably in their wildest dreams did not imagine how successful this order that they set up would be. I really do think they were trying to stave off the worst disasters. They were, like all statesmen, all statesmen focus on preventing what just happened from ever happening again. They're very infrequently are people looking that far ahead into the future. And so the order they created was designed to prevent the things that they had already seen. And just to think about what the basic elements of this order are, and Joanne actually sort of laid out what they are, but as they looked back on the period leading up to World War II, they saw that on the one hand, protectionist sentiment and efforts by the various power blocks to create autarkic economic spheres in which they would be dominant and would not actually engage in trade with one another. This was Hitler's ambition for Germany, that he would create a European market which would not depend on anyone else. It was certainly the Japanese goal with the Asian co-prosperity sphere, which was to have to be dominant in its own economic bloc. And then, of course, America played along for its own purposes with protectionist policies in the 1920s and then accelerating into the 1930s. And I think, so the founders of the order looked back on that and said that was a disaster. That not only did it actually lead to, bad economic consequences, which created poverty, which created radicalism and discontent, but it also sort of drove a deeper wedge between nations and sort of took already existing geopolitical competition and making it, and sort of exacerbating it by turning it as well into an economic competition. And that's why they wanted to establish as much of a free trading, open global economy as possible. Not, again, out of some idealistic belief that this would make all people behave better, but because they'd seen what the consequences of not having that kind of system were. And so I feel like, this is just an example, when you say to people today, here's the problem with protectionism, I don't think they're thinking about that problem. I think all they're thinking about is, well, haven't we been too nice to all other powers? And so this kind of, the reason why we have this order has been forgotten.